All right. Well, I'm not a particularly patient person, so I'm going to get us started. 9:02. That's enough lead time, right? So anyway, welcome to all of you at Housing California, both those of you who are here in Sacramento. It was nice to see a lot of you out and about at the convention center yesterday, even after hours. The Housers After Dark had a good participation. And also welcome to those of you who are coming to us virtually from other parts of California or even other places. So I know there's nothing like a conversation about streamlining state housing agencies to wake people up in the morning. So put your coffee aside, listen up, and hold on. In terms of sort of what we're going to do today, I think we are all well aware that in California, we have a fairly unideal housing funding system. For those of you who are on the development side, it will often take 2 years to get your various state funding sources together, not even counting the local funding sources that you bring in. It means multiple applications to multiple programs on different timelines. Many of those programs have competing priorities and push developers into different directions. I've had a couple of developers describe the state process as creating Frankenstein projects where you're trying to put different body parts together. And that's just from the developer side. That adds a lot of time, a lot of cost to the development process. And I'm in a unique position where I've actually worked with two of the different state housing agencies, both the Tax Credit Committee and the Department of Housing, and I've seen it from the state side as well. We have states, probably 4 or 5 state staff at different times who are reviewing applications for a single project. We fund a project in one program and it may or may not then be fully funded, and it may stall when it's not able to get funding from another program. We have sort of then orphan projects, and oftentimes those resources come back to the state to be reallocated. So I think we all agree that we have a fairly unideal system here in California. And the question is sort of, how do we improve that? How do we move forward? And so what we're going to do today is that we've invited a couple of guests from out of state. We have James Lenhoff from Minnesota and Ruth Mora from New York City, who are going to sort of tell us basically how things work in their jurisdictions. And while no program is ideal, I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from our partners in other parts of the country. And then we're going to have a discussion with Tony Sertich from the Controller's Office and among the panelists about, and with you all, frankly, too, on how we might be able to take some of those lessons learned from other states and apply them here in California to improve our system. And I think all of us would like to see a system where funding affordable housing can be done, quickly, efficiently, and then we can move to construction at a lesser cost. So that's sort of what we're here today. And I will acknowledge that we have made a few steps in this regard already. I think a number of you are aware that the legislature enacted AB 434 2 years ago, and that at least within the Department of Housing sort of started to align a number of the housing programs that HCD administers. And I think a lot of you are aware that just last week, the department put out its guidelines under the new sort of AB 434 multifamily housing finance program, where there'll be a single scoring system, and the awards will be both simultaneous, but also more aligned. And now we're trying to move that discussion to coordinating the various state agencies that are still involved. So we're making some steps here in California, but I think we all agree we have a long way to go. And then before we jump in too much further, I just want to give a special shout out to Macon Toganaga, who with the California Housing Partnership, who not only dreamed up this panel, but also has really helped organize it. She's also Tony's former partner at the Controller's Office, but we stole her away fair and square, and we are very happy to have her. And with that, I'm actually going to lead in. And we'll come back and we'll introduce James and Ruth a little bit more as we get into their presentations. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan for just a moment, and she actually has a phone quiz to sort of help bring you all into the fold and wake everybody up. Megan, do you want to carry that away?
Sure thing. Good morning, Mark. Thank you for the kind words, and to our panelists for being here today. It's a conversation near and dear to my heart as someone who spent some time at 2 different state agencies. So today I get to run our interactive activity. If you could all get out your smartphones, or if you prefer another web browser, please go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and enter the code. You can also scan the QR code for those who are so technically inclined, and we'll just give it another minute or two as folks join the quiz. So this is a pretty short, I think it's a 5-question poll. Your answers are all multiple choice, and the faster you answer, the more points you get. And there's actually a leaderboard so we can see how folks do in competing in these answers. So please take a second to log on. For those just joining, please go to menti.com and enter the code. It's 4570284.
So we have a competitive quiz. Is that what you're saying, Megan?
It is a competitive quiz with scores being kept. That's true.
Is there a prize for the winner?
I'll defer to you for that one, Mark.
It'll be the pride of victory.
Let's see how we're doing here. So we have some folks joining. Maybe let's give it another just minute or two. Please take a second to go to menti.com and enter this code 4570284. Maybe our tech folks can help with the info in the chat as well. There should be a link for easy access. Okay, with that, let's get started. Thanks for joining. Here's the first question. How many different state agencies administer affordable housing funds in California? You'll have 45 seconds to answer.
Can I throw up hand signals to give this away or anything?
No, no
You have
cheating.
enough fingers, Tony.
Okay, 10 seconds left. Only 12 responses in so far, so get your answers in. The right answer is 10 as of the enacted 2021-22 state budget. There was 13 in the proposed 2022-23 budget. So the correct answer was between 10 and 14 either way. So good job to the 4 of you that got that one right. Let's move on.
I noted that wow from you, Ruth. That's yeah, kind of scary, huh?
Good job to Belle, whoever you are out there. And let's go to the next question. Question 2. How many different multifamily housing programs does the state of California administer across agencies?
So the last one was how many agencies, and this is how many separate programs?
Correct. How many different programs does the state of California administer?
And an extra prize goes to those of you who've done a project with the most state sources in one project. Feel free to enter that in the chat if you think you're a competitor for that.
They've already been rewarded just by doing that, Mark.
Good.
So 10 seconds left. So the answer is over 20. I counted 27 programs when I looked at this between the 2021-22 enacted budget and the list of HCD programs on their NOFA calendar. And this number fluctuates, but I think it's consistently over 20.
I
see
know
how the
that when I was in
leaderboard is.
HD, they weren't all multifamily, but I think I had 20 programs under my purview at one time. That's actually what got me be pretty passionate about this issue too.
Snuggles.
Android. Love the pun. Doing well. Okay, next question. Question 3. How many states have housing departments reporting to different elected officials? 10 seconds left for any stragglers. The correct answer is 1. California is the only state, according to a report by the State Controller's Office put out in 2019. So this is something I'm sure that we'll be talking about in our session today. Good job to the 5 of you that got that right.
Wow, watching the leaderboards, kind of like watching the dot races at the ballpark. Like go back and forth, people surge, people fall back.
Climate and housing goals, very fitting. Okay, moving on to question 4. True or false, New York City provides tax-exempt bond financing as of right in a managed pipeline.
And a little known fact, while you all are thinking about that one, that actually New York City is my birth town. So first 4 years of my life in New York City. I don't talk about that much. I grew up in Washington State, but anyway, New York is my actual birthplace. So, yep, Ruth, I lived up at 125th and Riverside Drive when I started out,
Nice.
right by Riverside Church.
Beautiful over there.
This question is too easy. Almost everyone got it right. The answer is true. Ruth is going to tell us more. A close race we have going. Okay, going into the last question. Okay, last question. How many different funding sources can developers request in a single application in the Minnesota Housing Consolidated RFP?
And after the panel, we'll retest on all these and we'll know that you'll get them all right after that.
So whoever wins can just leave the panel because they already know enough, right?
Right. I guess this is what we called in my high school is a pre-test, right? You know, how are you doing before you learn the material?
Okay, 10 seconds left.
It's kind of like Final Jeopardy. We need the music.
So the right answer is 13 is the typical answer, although again, this fluctuates a little bit. So only 2 of you got that right, and I'm very eager to hear more from James about what that looks like in a single RFP. So with that, let's see how our leaderboard's doing.
The hustler coming through at the end.
SP coming in from behind. Congratulations.
Oh, wow.
Thanks for
All right.
playing. Okay, and then we did have one final activity, which is just to answer this last question, and we'll create a word cloud to help inspire the panel. The question is, how would you improve state housing administration in California? So if you could share just a few words, share a few words to help inspire us.
And then will we come back to this one, Megan?
Sure, we can flash it at the end, but it should generate the word cloud if you all submit some answers.
Okay.
Here we go.
All right. Speed, flexibility. Common thresholds, user-friendly, streamlined. All right, well, we have our work cut out for us.
Great, thank you all for participating.
Yep, thank you all.
I'll hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Megan. And with that, Megan, you're gonna, I think, pull up the slides. As we do that, I'm gonna introduce our first special guest. James Lenhoff is an assistant commissioner for the multifamily division at Minnesota Housing. And he's actually going to start talking to us about the Minnesota Annual Consolidated Plan that is, I think, a model that many of us have looked to for inspiration over time. And it is one that I think we'd all like to understand a little bit better. And again, there's no system is perfect or maybe exactly applicable to California, but I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn. And James has been a real pleasure to work with here. And I think we are very much looking forward to kind of understanding better how this Minnesota model works that we've looked to so often. So Megan, if you want to pull up the slides, we'll let James, you can do any further introduction you like and take it away.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for having me at the conference today. It's been fun to prepare for this. It's been actually a good reminder about the pros and cons of the Minnesota system. And I hope I don't destroy any of the myth today with it, but there's also a lot of great things about it. So again, I'm James Lenhoff, the Assistant Commissioner for the Multifamily Division at Minnesota Housing. I've been with the agency just a little over 3 years. And prior to that, I actually worked in affordable housing development. So I was one of those developers out there and got to critique the system that I'm about to talk about today, but also worked in local government and municipal finance. Let's go ahead, if the slides are ready. Excellent. Thank you. And we can go ahead and go to the second slide. And I'll go through this pretty quickly. So Minnesota Housing Finance Agency was created in 1971, a super popular time for creating housing finance agencies around the country. We are a state agency, one of actually two that has an involvement in affordable housing funding, though the other one only is involved in volume cap limited bonds for 4% credits, and there's essentially no overlap in projects for a whole bunch of reasons that could be probably its own panel. We have a commissioner and a 7-member board, both appointed by the governor. We are unique, at least amongst other Minnesota state agencies, in that we are financially self-supporting. We do not get administrative funds from the state, though we do get various appropriations to fund programs. And we have that little ability to issue bonds, which has proven to be helpful over the years in a wide variety of programs. Of course, today talking about the rental side, but also we have a single family division that works on home ownership and rehab, capacity building, and significant efforts around housing stability programs and working to prevent and end homelessness. Next slide, please. So the Minnesota Consolidated RFP, I'm here to talk about and probably talk fast in just a few minutes on what is a big program, maybe leaving you with a few more questions and answers today, but certainly happy to help discuss more. So the Minnesota Multifamily Consolidated RFP, it is a one-stop-ish shop for capital funding. And I have to put the ish part on there, not because it's a bad thing, but it's because there are a few programs that don't totally fit within this process. And I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Within this process, we have new construction, acquisition, rehab, and adaptive reuse, and a wide variety of project types: general occupancy workforce, permanent supportive housing, senior housing, and preservation deals. I think it is important to know, because it is notably different than the California process, is that we use a forward allocation funding model. And what I mean by that is that when projects come into Minnesota Housing, they often do have other funding sources that are committed, and they do have site control, but it is rare that they are fully designed or have any land use entitlements. So it's we fully expect that numbers will end up changing along the way, and certainly as they lead up to closing. Next slide, please. All right, so we just had the quiz on the different funding sources included in our consolidated RFP, but just a quick rundown of what that is, because it is quite the array of funding programs. Of course, 9% low-income housing tax credits, 4% low-income housing tax credits. We have our own allocation of tax-exempt volume limited bonds that Minnesota Housing gets to do with what we please, and we actually use it for both single-family and multifamily purposes. We have a variety of state appropriations for different deferred loan programs that has changed a bit over the year, and I'll spare you all the 3- and 4-letter designation and just say one is for workforce housing and one is for preservation, particularly of projects with federal rental subsidies. But then we also have this uniquely Minnesota creation called the Housing Infrastructure Bonds that we use to fund deferred loans. In the last few years, we've had $80 to $100 million that have just come through HIBs, but specifically, it can only be used for new permanent supportive housing, new senior housing, and preservation of federally assisted units. Wait, there's more. Next slide. We also include federal resources, Home National Housing Trust Fund. Minnesota has been a recipient of numerous contracts through the Section 811 Project-Based Rental Assistance Program, where we also issue awards through the Consolidated RFP. At Minnesota Housing, since we do generate some of our own resources, we offer various deferred and cash flow loans at our own discretion. We are a robust first mortgage lender, primarily through the HUD Risk Share program. And because the word consolidated is included, it isn't just Minnesota Housing. We actually do have a couple other public funding partners that directly participate, meaning that they choose projects that are submitted through our consolidated RFP process where we share application materials and coordinate. But then what I broadly refer to as coordinating selections. Like many other states, we have local jurisdictions with various types of funding sources. The timing doesn't totally align with all of them, but they do participate, and we have active discussions with them so that we're not choosing the same projects or over subsidizing. And I don't know if this applies in California, but in Minnesota, we actually have a couple sub allocators of 9% credits. Minnesota Housing being by far the primary one here, and we do coordinate on those against that. We're maximizing our selections. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I think that all adds up to 13. It's been 14 and 15 at various years, maybe down to 9 in some years. It fluctuates based on the whims of the legislature and the resources that we get. But we do try to keep them consolidated. So just briefly about the process. And again, this is super, super high level, but a year before the consolidated RFP comes out, Minnesota Housing is working on our strategic plan and priorities, our, of course, our qualified allocation plan, and then the self-scoring worksheet, which in some places specifically refers to tax credits, but we actually use throughout the entire consolidated RFP. Recently, we switched to a 2-year process, which I'm eternally grateful that we did that so that we're not updating all of that every single year. We do a review every other year, and that has definitely opened up some time and flexibility to review what's working and what isn't. Because it is a rather vast and complex process, we do provide technical assistance. We'll provide technical assistance to 100, 150 projects in a given year during that time frame from our underwriting and asset management teams. The full application materials come out in April, where as will be critiqued by developers on our side, and I used to critique, it is an extensive application process that I'll talk about momentarily. We do an intent to apply in May. That has evolved over time, but the primary purpose now is not as a gatekeeping element, but as an information sharing, because we are in the midst of our legislative session, and I like to know how many projects anticipate coming in and how many resources they need, and we can use that for advocacy to help try to get additional funding. It just happens that the timing aligns, and our full applications are due in July. Once applications are come into Minnesota Housing, we do a scoring based on, and we consider resource availability, which we'll know by that point. I'll talk more about that again in a moment. We also do something that started about 5 years ago called early no's, and it's exactly what it sounds like for those projects that have no chance of moving forward because we don't have the resources or don't score high enough or don't meet a threshold. We tell them before we get to the end of the process so that they know. It can sound a little bit harsh, but it's actually really popular because then developers can make choices on how they want to move forward well before the process is done. Once we get past that early no process, that's where we dive deeper into our feasibility reviews, underwriting, and preliminary design. Again, the buildings are not fully designed at that point. Our board takes the staff recommendations in December and announces selections. And since we do this forward allocation model, closing and construction can be anywhere from 9 to 24 months, depending on how fast a developer is after that, where we do have that final underwriting design reviews and theme of the day, addressing gaps during that process. Let's go ahead and do the next slide, please. So what goes into that application process? Since we have all these different funding sources, we provide the option to applications coming in where they can submit a dual application. They can choose if they want to submit as a 9%, as a 4%, or submit 2 pro formas and submit as both in a single application. When it comes to all those different deferred loan resources, developers don't choose. They just put in the number that they would like, subject to our underwriting. The numbers often change, but they don't actually identify which it is. And that is actually a little bit easier than it sounds because a number of those resources, and the reason I wanted to list them out, is that some of them have very restricted eligible uses. So it ends up pairing naturally with some applications. Not always as perfectly as I would like, but Minnesota Housing assigns which resource and which form of tax credits goes to a particular project. The developer application can also request a first mortgage from Minnesota Housing and volume cap limited bonds in that, though they're not required to use our first mortgage. It's a competitive product. And then developers also include a rather extensive set of narratives and supporting documentation. I don't have a slide long enough to have all the forms that are currently required to submit as that process. I encourage you to look at our website, and it's a subject of much debate. Within the Minnesota housing scoring and selection process, going back to that time frame, we have a single scoring rubric for all of those applications. They all get one single score, regardless of the application type or the funding resource. And as I noted, we align, meaning staff with board approval aligns and assigns the funding resources based on eligible project type. But as I noted, with the different funding resources, not all of them can just be used for anything. And so if you think about each funding resource being in its own bucket and sometimes paired together, is that we have the scoring and it sort of filters out into each bucket. You can fund so many workforce projects because I only have so much funding for workforce. You can so much preservation because I only have so much funding for preservation, and so on. Scoring rules the day for our 9% applications based on our statutes, but other considerations for all the other projects, we do consider feasibility, of course. Geographic distribution is a statutory requirement for us. We look at the amount of funding requested. Ideally, not all funding goes to a single project. Our ability to minimize or eliminate gaps, and then organizational capacity as well to take on multiple projects, or if they have a number of projects that have been previously selected but not yet closed. Next slide, please. So what's the good here? Because it is all rainbows and unicorns. I assure you, nothing ever goes awry in this process. But the best part of it is the single application and scoring to be able to get all of those funding resources. The alternative, doing multiple RFPs, I will be honest, sounds a little scary to me. I also grew up in this system, so sometimes we forget how good it can be to actually just have that one application process. It's not always been true, though, that there's only been one scoring. You go back a few years and there was 2 or 3 different scoring processes. That was worse. Don't do that. It was really complex, especially when you had projects that were ranking in different ways because of different scoring. The flexibility with the resource allocation is mighty because it allows us to address and fit the right resource to the right project. I don't think we have as many as California, but we have a lot of resources, thankfully. It allows us to eliminate or minimize gaps, at least theoretically. The past few months have proven that wrong with the quick change in construction costs. But also the partnerships, the communication coordination with developers who become accustomed to the process with our other funding partners and coordinators. And we actually share our application materials with many of those other public funding partners. In fact, a number of them use Minnesota Housing's application materials so that they're using the same materials, even if the timing happens to be a little bit different. And the good is the collective impact. We can see what is the total extent of what our resources are able to reach in a given year. And in fact, the single family division also has a consolidated RFP, and we announce all at the same time. So the showing that big impact is actually really important for us from a communication and leveraging standpoint. Next slide, please. For the parts that, because I'm Minnesotan, I'm just going to say less good rather than bad. Is the reality, right? Different programs with different statutory authorities and different rules mashed into one process. You know what I'm talking about, where they calculate income in 3 different ways between different programs or rents. We have the same thing. What it has led to is an extensive application materials to address the myriad of program requirements, which honestly can be a challenge when you're trying to address a statutory preference in one spot and then a rule somewhere else and trying to keep that all together. And it requires creative maneuvering to maintain obligations. The other part is the train never stops. It never, ever stops. You already know what that's like, I'm sure, in California with project, the RFPs have to keep going. But when everything is consolidated together, it's really hard to step outside of that. And then new cars keep being added to that train, new funding sources, new programs, new requirements. We're trying to work on that. Next slide, please. And then finally, my advice around this. A gatekeeper is fantastic. And I know it sounds fantastic here in Minnesota, right? A gatekeeper for all the application materials and requirements is really important. As this system grew in Minnesota, and particularly in Minnesota Housing, it was distributed reviews inside of Minnesota Housing. And what that led to is anytime something went wrong, a new form or a new question was added without a single person or a couple of people dictating what should be included in the selection materials, what should be included in the applications. And it led to a lot of band-aids. We've been going through that the last few years to help streamline that, but it's an ever-learning process. Scoring balancing. With a single scoring, it can get out of whack pretty quickly if you're not careful, or suddenly all workforce housing projects rise to the top, but rehab doesn't, or permanent supportive housing, or what have you. Our research team, who is fantastic, spends time with that. Not surprisingly, words matter, may, shall. It's a competitive process. I was a developer too. You look for every possible way through that process to find the score that you want. And people do find their way, which is what we're asking them to do in a competitive process. Words matter. It's a continuous update in that. Don't be afraid to communicate the story, especially if you move forward with this. Brag. Talk about the good parts and remind people of what it used to be. And I actually spend a fair amount of time talking about the alternative, even when it's hard to prove the negative, but the other side, I think, would be more complex. And then finally, as I'm speeding through this to not take up the whole presentation, not every program fits into a consolidated model, and that's okay. We too, at Minnesota Housing, have other capital programs that exist outside of the consolidated RFP because either the rules just don't fit or the types of projects just don't work with this type of model. Don't force it. It doesn't have to work that way, but a lot of programs really can work together. I'm also fortunate in Minnesota, it does not require statutory authority to do this. We just have the ability to have a consolidated model. With that, I will happily move on to the next person so that I can also learn more of this, and I'm sure it's some time for discussion at the end. So thank you for that, Mark.
Thank you very much, James. I think there's a lot of inspiration there for all of us. There's a couple of questions come up and one or two occur to me too. So if you don't mind, we'll take a couple of questions for you directly before we move on to Ruth. So Capri Roth is a well-known developer with us. Thanks, Capri, for adding in. But I don't know if you can see the Q&A, James, but it's she's hoping that you can talk about how the Minnesota program changed or didn't change once you exceeded the volume cap for tax-exempt bonds.
I don't know that it changed, but then the buckets of review get altered, right? So we only have so much volume cap in any given year that can go towards this process. And since we have the single scoring process, we just go down the list to as many as that we can fit. And Minnesota Housing does prioritize rehab in particular with volume cap. So I actually don't think it changed our process so much as we focused on our priorities for which projects we're able to select.
And then one that occurred to me is that you mentioned a bunch of sort of specialized programs and do you have one program that's sort of a catch-all? So I know, for example, in California, we have various specialty programs, but then we have one that's sort of our omnibus rental housing program known as the multifamily housing program. And the way we've thought about that is, people would, if they're eligible for specialized funds, we might give them that. But if they don't, if we've run out of those specialized funds, then they can try to fall down into the multifamily housing program bucket and get a second bite at the apple because it's more general. Is that something that you all have access to, or are they all specialized funds?
They're all pretty specialized. Home, I dare say, might be the most flexible one. And I dare say that, but thank you to our HUD partners for our home funding. With it, in our 9% credits, but for the longest time in Minnesota, we did not have any funding to do senior housing, and we still don't use 9% credits for senior housing, and that's where housing infrastructure bonds came in to be. So it wasn't so much that we have this one single flexible resource, we added resources in to create new programs so we could be more flexible. Really and truly the most flexible resource we have is our agency generated resources, because those have no statutory limitations. But our limitation there is, well, how much money have we generated this year that we can put towards programs? And when it's 1, 2, 3, 4 million a pop, doesn't go very far on that part of it. So this is where that tough balancing is with all the statutes and rules that go with each program to pair the projects just right.
Right. And then I assume as you rank your projects, and you assign and resources, you sort of move down from, the top ranking project gets, whatever, I don't know, more what they'd be likely interested in using. And then as you get further down the list you're just sort of whatever's left is kind of going to those projects. And how does that work out from the developer side? Have they been able to adapt like that pretty well?
Well, I'm sure that they have critical feedback for us on some of how that works, because it does get complex to explain. Because a higher scoring project can be skipped over if we no longer have any more of our workforce housing funding, but a preservation deal scores lower. So it actually would have been a great slide addition. If I take all of the applications that came in our last consolidated RFP, every single one gets scored, but of course there are different types of projects with that different mix of uses. And so yes, you're absolutely right. We start at the top, but really with 9% being the most scarce resource and in some ways the most flexible, starting off with the projects that we can use 9% for and going down. And actually what we'll do is then we'll pull apart the scoring into the different buckets of workforce, rehab, senior, and permanent supportive housing, because then within those we can take the top scoring projects and select those until we run out of money, theoretically.
And you survive that process, and it seems like every year you do it and you make it through.
We do it every single year. It certainly is an internal effort, but where we also have the benefit in Minnesota is that we've been doing this for almost 20 years. So we're no longer in the space of trying to defend this as how it's done. And I do think people see the benefits for it. We're in the space of going, have we gone too far of having too extensive an application? Not to pull funding sources out of it, but what do we really need to make selections with our forward allocation model? And we've crossed that line and had to pull back in a few spots. Have we made it too complex? I saw in the word cloud there, fast. People want it to be faster. So do we. And we're trying to figure out ways to do that and still meet all of our statutory requirements. So it's not perfect, but it works.
I'm going to take one more quick question for you and then we'll move on. But how do you provide resources to tribal applicants?
Yeah, actually within our scoring process, tribal, for the most part, tribal applications get additional scoring. They are a priority here in Minnesota. But otherwise they compete in the same scoring system as well. So just based on the strategic priorities, they compete really well, but they don't have a separate process or a separate set aside.
But in general, you funded a number of tribal projects, or there's some minimum level that you historically do?
Yep. Yeah. We don't have a particular number that we assign for a particular number of projects or selections for tribal applications, but they tend to be very competitive in the Minnesota housing process.
Great. Thank you. There are a couple more questions. I'm going to come back to them later on in the presentation, but at this point, we're going to shift over to Ruth Mora, who's joining us from New York City. She is the Executive Vice President for Development of the New York City Housing Development Corporation that runs a more of a managed pipeline approach. And so she's going to tell us about that. And Ruth, feel free to take it away and provide any further self-introduction that you would like.
Sure. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to join this group. It's always interesting to hear how similar, but also how different our agency is from other states. My name is Ruth Mora. I'm the EVP of Development at HDC. We are basically the bond issuer for the city of New York. There is a state agency, a state HFA, which is New York State HCR, Homes and Community Renewal, who also does bond issuances on a more limited basis in the city of New York, but they also they do more of the upstate and the other cities in the state. So we are actually very similar in corporate structure, as James explains, for Minnesota Housing. We were established also in 1971 for the purpose of financing affordable housing through the issuance of bonds, tax-exempt and or taxable bonds. We also have a seven-member board of directors who are appointed by the mayor of New York City and also by the governor of New York State. Very similar to Minnesota, we are a self-supporting agency. We don't have a budget allocation, either local, state, or federal. We basically raise our own money, and the way we do that is origination fees, asset management fees, and we also do spread on the rates that we set for our mortgages, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But basically, all of that income feeds our programs, and we also provide 1% subsidy loans on deals. Now, the president of HDC is appointed by the mayor of New York City, and is also chaired by the commissioner of our board is chaired by the commissioner of our sister agency, which is NYC HPD, Housing and Preservation Development. The commissioner is also appointed by the city of New York. And we, in addition to doing sort of that city housing plan financing, we are also very closely tied with the New York City Housing Authority and kicked off a program a couple of years ago called PACT Initiative, which is Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. And under that program, we're able to reposition and do RAD conversions of New York City's Housing Authority portfolio. Next slide. The one after. So as I mentioned, our sibling agency, HPD and HDC, we have a shared mission. Our governance, basically a mayoral and gubernatorial governance. We are approximately 190 employees at HDC. We manage approximately $24 billion in assets. And then just about development. So HDC and HPD have mirror programs. The housing plan under which we finance our deals and our programs, basically the city's financing plan. HPD kind of is the role of the policy arm of the city, where a lot of the policy initiatives come out from, and HDC is considered the executioner of those policies. So we do all of the financing in relation to it, but only with respect to bond financing. We are a little bit different from many HFAs in the sense that we only do 4% credits and bond issuances. We don't allocate 9%. So we do get the volume cap as of right from the city and from the state, but we do not do any 9% allocations. HPD they do have their own funding rounds for 9%, and there is a separate application process, which HTC is separate from, but on the 4%, they are the allocating credit agency, and we are the bond issuer for those credits. Next slide. So here, just basically, we're talking about some of the similarities. I mean, us and HPD, and to some degree, we are growing this relationship with the New York City Housing Authority. We have a bit of a symbiotic relationship. I mentioned we have complementary programs. We have a tax credit program currently that it's called ELA, which is Extra Low Income Affordability Program. And HPD has exactly the same program. The term sheets are basically mirrors of each other. Our term sheet really goes around the bond financing and our 1% as of right subsidy financing that comes along with that senior loan. And then HPD does the gap mortgages. And they also play, again, sort of like the more discretionary approvals. They provide planning services. They do all of the coordination with city planning, with the myriad alphabet soup of agencies, DEP, Department of Finance, MTA, if the site is close to MTA, just various other different agencies that are involved as part of providing discretionary approvals. We both do new construction and preservation financing. I mentioned the tax credit program, which is basically HTC's bread and butter program. We also have a mixed income program, which is a mix of tax credit, typically up to 50% of a project is a tax credit, and the other 50% is moderate and or middle income. And I'll talk a little bit about how we finance that further on. And then we have our own capital markets group. Basically, that team structures the bonds and works with municipal bankers externally to sort of when we do our issuances, we structure the bonds along with them, and the bankers go out and sell our bonds. But we are pretty much involved from the beginning. And then intergovernmental relationships. So HPD does a lot of the city council, state and federal, but we also have a pretty hefty legislative group here, and really mainly on the state and federal side. And we do a lot of advocacy work on the tax credit side. We pushed a lot, the 4% fix, that was something that was pretty big here. We did a lot of legislative work around that in conjunction with HPD. We did the same thing with income averaging, and many, many years ago with the use of recycled bonds. And then just like on the marketing and asset management piece, so where we are doing joint deals, HTC is basically the lead. We do all of the marketing, asset management, long-term asset management, and regulatory compliance for all of the deals that HTC and HPD finance together. There was one joint regulatory agreement, and I would have to say, it was very painful getting to a joint agency regulatory agreement. And it took a lot of conversations, not just within the legal groups of both agencies, but also with the city's law department. And then once that was done, it took a lot of conversations with external stakeholders, developers, and the various industry groups. And I'd have to say it's still a work in progress, and there are definitely lots of lessons learned. But I don't think you ever in any program will get to a sort of standard template on a reg agreement. But I think, we've made a lot of progress through conversations. I've been able to address both policy and sort of business issues. Next slide. Okay, and we did talk about a managed pipeline. So for the 4% bond pipeline, there isn't an application round. It's basically as of right. The credits come with the bonds, and the projects also get, as I mentioned, subsidy financing, and it's term sheet and programmatic. On the ELA, it's $65,000 a unit. No more than that for HTC, with a cap of $20 million. And then HPD has up to a certain amount per unit as well. There are instances where a deal does go above that, and many factors will impact that. So as I mentioned, HTC issues the bonds, HPD provides the 4% tax credit allocation. We do coordinated, the financing programs and term sheets. And now the way the managed pipeline, the way the priorities are set. So we have ongoing meetings with HPD, the two development groups and sort of the leaders of each development area meet on a regular basis. And the pipeline is managed with a couple of things in mind. One is the length of time a project is in the pipeline. I think we all know what a tight resource volume cap is. So we could only do so much. And, New York City is a high cost area. So we burn through our volume cap fairly quickly. So that is one of the factors that comes into play when we're determining how to queue up a project. Then two, how does the project meet the goals of the housing plan? Was there a specific rezoning for the project or in a neighborhood? And does this project sort of meet the goals of that rezoning? And as part of the negotiations with the local electeds in supporting and approving a rezoning, there is sort of deals that are in the pipeline, and how do you structure deals in order to meet those rezoning goals? So that is another factor. Are there specific homeless and of supportive housing goals? How does a project meet those goals? And as you're tracking how much you've delivered from a unit and project perspective, it does kind of shift a little bit. If you start getting short on one goal, you do kind of look at the pipeline and see, okay, where can we fill in? What can we pull and shift around a little bit in order to begin filling, meeting those goals? Same thing on MWBE, and if there are any sustainability or other sort of miscellaneous initiatives. So that's another factor that comes into play. And then third is the development for a city-led RFP. So HTC does not own land, but HPD, the city of New York, does. And what they do is they put out RFPs for developers, and there is sort of a team, and it includes planning, it includes HPD development, it includes HPD's Office of Neighborhood Strategies, and it includes HTC development, all as part of the scoring team. And they all, they are the financing is provided under the financing programs that the city has, both HTC and HPD. So the submittals are coming in under those programs, and then they get scored based on, the goals of the RFP and how they meet that. So those are the three factors that sort of come into play when determining how to queue up a project in the pipeline. Next slide. So financing cycles. This is important because, there are so many projects in our pipeline, and we are not really closing projects every month. So what we do is we pool, pooled bond issuances under our open resolution indenture, and this indenture permits for parity debt. So basically, it's like this open-ended revolving resolution, and we just keep, every time we issue, it goes into that resolution. And I'll talk a little bit about how HTC has built wealth and that's really what feeds our subsidy budget that we can then in turn put into as second subordinate mortgages at 1%. So typically we have a frequency of issuance. There are two major issuances. One is in June, and that ties with the city's fiscal year end. And then the second is in December, and that's really to sort of be able to be in a position to use all of the volume cap. So those are the two major cycles, and they're usually where our light tech transactions are. We more often in the past couple of years also have spring and fall issuances, and they happen anytime between March and April, or in between September and October. And a lot of the financing in there is sometimes a lot for preservation. We do securitization of our 1% subordinate mortgages. And then at times, depending on how deals are ready, we will go ahead and do some light tech transactions in those issuances as well. So an issuance can have anywhere between, a minimum of 4 to 8 or 9 tax credit transactions, all is happening under one bond issuance. And then just as part of managing the pipeline, there are interagency biweekly meetings between the development groups and leadership in those development groups. And it is truly a pipeline tracking meeting. You're going through the pipeline, you're going through the next financing cycle, you're going through all the due diligence, what's needed from a discretionary approval perspective from any agency. HPD also, they also provide the tax abatements. Some of them are discretionary, they have to be voted on by City Council. There are various Office of Management and Budget approvals that are secured. So in order for us to have a successful pooled issuance, we get to a point where if you're in a June cycle, by the end of May, we're scheduled to go to our board. That is kind of like the trigger where everyone works towards that deadline to have secured lender approval, investor approval, all third-party reports, all discretionary funding, and site control, if that's also one of one of the things that you're seeking to get as part of the transaction. So then the next thing is, the other thing is, aside from those meetings with development, HDC and HPD also have monthly meetings with City Hall officers on the housing side. And again, sort of discuss the pipeline to some degree, because it is managed, and as part of things shifting, there's lessons learned to come. As part of things shifted, there are always unhappy clients with that as well, if people get delayed. So it's all about sort of making sure the goals of the housing plan, the administration's goals, are being met. And the monthly City Hall, HPD, HDC meetings are part of just tracking this big movement towards that pooled issuance. Next, and I'll just go through this one quick. I mentioned open resolution, and this is really what gives HDC the ability to do pooled issuances. It was created in 1993, and I believe as of probably March or April of this year, we were up to our 337th bond issuance, all under this open resolution. There's $20.6 billion of bonds as of the end of last year, almost $14 billion worth of assets. And when I talked a little bit about setting mortgage rates, because we are on these deals are also senior lenders. So we are, we're the bond issuer, senior lender, we're providing construction and permanent financing. And James talked a little bit about this with FHA risk share lending. That is something that we also do. We have our in-house mortgage insurance. So we have the capacity to provide mortgage insurance for the loans that we finance on the long-term side. But it's really, we set rates based on conversations with our capital markets group and conversations with municipal bankers. And in those rates, there is a bit of a spread. And it is really that spread and the growth of the assets in that open resolution that have given HDC the ability to provide subsidy financing along with the city's subsidy financing. And, we do, it's 1% paid. Part of this is also allows us to take those cash flows, those future cash flows, and securitize those loans in the future, use those proceeds, and then throw them right back into the open resolution and reuse them in our subsidy loans. So that's just a quick overview of our open resolution. And just really, it's like one of the very important tools for us. Next slide. And this is an example of what we've done. For example, in December of 2021, we financed almost 1,200 units. And as you can see, there are 245 projects here. This was all part of a pooled issuance. All the ELA program is all our tax credit program. You've got the senior loans here, roughly $250 million in senior loans. And then between that, we have roughly $316 million of senior loan. And of that 316, $250 million of that was considered volume cap bonds that counted against our allocation. And then the balance, $65 million, is what we call recycled cap. So typically we structure our loans anywhere between 30 and 40 years. The cash flows on the bonds are supported by the mortgage payments. So we structure the real estate side, and then capital markets sort of takes that and then turns it into what you see here vis-a-vis a bond sale. Next slide. And then this is just a sample of a project that we did. So in the first one, you see the volume cap on this project that we closed in December of last year. So roughly $48 million in volume cap bonds. You also see $20 million in recycled bonds. And then we have our HDC second. This is our 1% mortgage. So there's a subsidy in there of $20 million. So it's either, for us, it's either $65,000 a unit up to a cap of $20 million. So this was a pretty big project. It's 376 units. So we capped it at 20 million. And then you have the HPD, you have the city subsidy in here, which is the third mortgage, and that's roughly $52 million. So all like these three sources right here are done with a combination of all of the sort of symbiotic relationship between the two agencies. The development teams at the project manager level, they all look at the deal simultaneously, They comment on the underwriting to developers, lenders, syndicators simultaneously. It's basically, we try to act as one voice going externally because it impacts the budget and what we're trying to do here. And obviously you have, other sources here. And as you can see, our permanent mortgage here was $35 million, and that's a FHA risk share. Our subsidy loan is in here, as well as the HPD loans on the perm side. Next slide. So that's our managed pipeline. Lessons learned. I mean, definitely, I think the pluses for us is it really does allow for the city to prioritize the pipeline in a way that helps it meet its goals. Especially if you have pretty aggressive goals or a pretty aggressive initiative. So it does allow for that. It allows for us to be able to slate a deal in a particular closing cycle and be able to meet that. And over the years, we have developed efficient financing. We do a condominium regime here in New York City, where basically, the sample project you saw had a piece of volume cap and a piece of recycled. And that was, even though it's a tax credit deal, the ELA program is 70% LIHTC, and then up to 30% of the project can be moderate and or middle income that doesn't get tax credits. So what we do is we basically establish what we call a LIHTC, a low income condo, and the costs associated with that condo, and it's done on a square foot basis, on a cost basis. The costs associated with that are financed with what we call volume cap bonds. And then the costs associated with the moderate and or middle income, the non-LIHTC condo, we can use recycled bonds to finance that. That doesn't provide credits, but recycled bonds are considered tax exempt financing. So you get one rate for the entire project. It is one loan, it is one collateral, but that collateral is just made up of different condominiums. And if there's like community facility space, or if there's a retail space, those are also further condoed out, and they do not become part of the volume cap calculation. So that really has allowed us to save on volume cap on a pretty big deal. If you've got like 100% LIHTC deal, it's easier. But if you've got a middle income deal, even if you've got 30% of that deal at almost 400 units, you could see $20 million of saving volume cap on just one project can be, it's pretty powerful. And then the other, I think the other piece that we kind of learned was preservation without bonds and credits. So that is, I have to say, very controversial in New York. We shifted, I would say maybe about 4-5 years ago, to doing preservation on an either taxable basis. We issued taxable bonds to finance that preservation deals, or if there are enough good costs, enough rehab costs associated with it, we can even do it on a tax exempt recycle basis. So you don't get credits, but you can get the benefit of tax exempt bond financing, which just equates to a slightly lower rate. So again, not very popular with a lot of developers, but I think we have been in New York City very successful at shifting away from the cap and credit model. And it was something that HFA, the New York State Housing Authority, ended up adopting about 2 years ago as well, as a way to manage the volume cap allocations. And we pretty much allocate all of the volume cap that we get to the new construction pipeline. And that's a way to help that pipeline move a little quicker. So the bad part of this is lessons learned. The managed pipeline, and because you're kind of sometimes at times are shifting certain priorities, can cause delays and has caused a backlog as priorities and as priorities change or resources are limited. We at HDC say we get an average of $800 million in volume cap on a yearly basis. So, it becomes, and because New York City is such a high cost city, we pretty much, and because it's such a long pipeline, we pretty much burn through that pipeline right away and are in positions to sometimes have to shift a deal to the next closing cycle. So that is, that's one of the cons against the managed pipeline. I think what has helped, I would say in the last 2 years, is improved communication. But really letting developers know, giving them a realistic estimated timing for when they are in a pipeline. And, these days, we don't talk in a month. We just say you're in, the June of 2022 cycle. And everyone kind of knows, okay, I need to start getting myself ready from a third party report, from a lending perspective, from a syndicator perspective, about maybe 4 to 5 months before that, so that I can meet that closing cycle and all of the deadlines behind that. It also has, given developers an indication of that, also has led to a little bit of reduction in pre-development costs. If someone if you have so many starts and stops, it's just the nature of this kind of stuff. And if you're, paying up money for architects for reports that have to be rerun if you get pushed, to the following year, or ordering appraisals or ordering environmental reports, or just anything that you're sort of outlaying cash, and a lot of those reports just end up going stale, or that information ends up going stale. If you understand where in a closing cycle are, you're better able to manage that. I think what we found is a lot of the soft costs and some of the deals were just repetitive. There's no need to pay $50,000 for an appraisal. And part of the reason that maybe that cost was high was because you had to do 3 appraisals because you just kept getting bumped. So I think giving people a realistic timing of when they can finance the project has helped. And then what we always also do, and a lot of the banks and syndicators that operate in New York City are repetitive. I mean, we've got maybe probably like 4 banks and then maybe like 5 syndicators, and they kind of understand this cycle. They understand the managed pipeline nature. And a lot of times them and their development teams also come in and meet with the agencies, and we do joint HTC, HPD, and bank/syndicator pipeline meetings. And those teams come and say like, hey, these developers are talking to me about, closing this in your June cycle. Does that seem right? And, provided that we've basically message the same to the developer, will say the same thing. So it really does, you kind of end up getting the same information both on the development end, but also on the lending and investor side. And I think that is.
Thank you,
it.
Ruth. Thank you very much. And there's a lot of really good information there. I think the pooled bond issuance I find particularly innovative. I think that's really something that we might want to spend a little bit more time here. We have various issuers, but I think there's a lot to be, maybe some real efficiencies there. I'm going to move over to Tony real quick. We'll come back to some of the questions and answers, but we want to make sure we have time. And Ruth, again, thank you for that. I know you may need to leave for another meeting, but we welcome you to stay as long as you can, but I understand if you need to go. But Tony, I'm going to switch it over to you. All of us know Tony Sertich, who's a deputy controller with Treasurer Betty Controller Betty E, excuse me. And he is also a sitting member of TCAC and SIDLAC. So Tony, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Ruth and James, for giving the great overview. I think one of the things that
Tony, I'm sorry, before you start, I very much apologize, but I do have to run.
We understand, and we'll take care of some of the questions, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly go through some of our thoughts. Controller Yee is very focused on streamlining state government and making it run as efficiently as possible. And with all of the money that's gone into housing over the last several years, or few years, maybe it's a better term, there's a big focus in making sure that we get the most out of the investment that the state's putting out there. Along with that, her role on the SIDLAC and TCAC, we really want to make sure that we're building as much housing, because it's, as we all know, it's a huge problem in the state, affordable housing, and making sure that we have enough of it. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So I'll go over this real quickly, but this gets back to some of the questions that we had in the quiz, just sort of how the state housing finance system is structured. We have a lot of different entities that have their hands in housing financing around the state, and there's a lot of different reporting, and it's not the most efficient method. I think all would agree that if we were starting today, we probably would not design it like this, but this is where we're starting from today. So the question is, how can we improve it marginally so that we can get more housing built? If you can move on. So we brainstormed at the controller's office of different ideas that we could do within the housing infrastructure, state's infrastructure, to really help make things, reduce the time it takes to build housing and reduce the cost it takes to build housing. And one thing that Mark had mentioned earlier on was that this idea of working at different entities and seeing all the different lags that are caused by these different inefficiencies in the structure. So we thought about, ultimately, if we had to start all over, we could create one state housing agency. That would be a huge lift at this point, and it's not something we're proposing, but it is something that I think if we were starting today, we probably might use that method. So less than that, there's basic small steps that we could take to help streamline our agency. One of the things that we heard from James earlier was creating a unified competition for all state multifamily housing bonds or funds. I mean, maybe not all, but everything that works within a unified structure. Another thing that the state is lacking is a data system, sort of a data system where all the different state entities, whether it's CalHFA, HCD, SIDLAC, and TCAC, all sort of funnel the data through the same system so that we can track better and really have a better understanding of how the state's spending its money and what it's getting out of its funds. So the numbers here are sort of maybe the biggest impact to the smallest impact, but really, it's really a lot of work that we can do on the front end to streamline. There's also work on the back end, on the monitoring side. And I know there's a bill going through the legislature about cleaning up some of the multiple monitoring functions that the different state entities provide as well. So with that, I'll leave this open for questions, but I guess move on to the next slide would be great. So a bill that we're sponsoring, the controller is sponsoring by Assemblymember Grayson, does create this one-stop shop. And what we're trying to accomplish with this is really building off of the AB 434 that Mark had mentioned earlier, that HCD is implementing and rolling out now, and really layering on more funding programs into a one-stop shop. So that would include SIDLAC and TCAC. It would include other programs that may be administered by HCD. The language in the bill right now is fairly broad. It really creates a committee that will decide how these funds will be administered, but it does create a single application. It does create a single scoring process. And I think, we have plenty of thoughts about how this could work, but I do want to encourage folks to provide feedback on how we can make this happen. So that if and when this gets implemented, we have the best outcomes. I think we've learned a lot from Minnesota. We've learned a lot from New York, and I know we're running low on time. So Mark, if there's anything that you want me to cover specifically, I'm happy to do that, but I do want to make sure we leave it open for questions as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue. So what I would really like, I have a couple of questions here. I encourage other people to put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. But more importantly, I'd actually like your thoughts, comments on what you liked or didn't like from the Minnesota and the New York City presentations. Are there things that you think we should try and pursue here in California? I know that for me, I really like the Minnesota model in many, many ways. And I think our idea of a one-stop shop sort of is based largely on what they have done. I find it intriguing that in Minnesota, they sort of assign the resources. And I had always thought in California, we would have more of the developers would be a little bit more in the driver's seat on resources, and that they might, prioritize what resources they would like to receive from the state. And as the state went down the ranking order, they would, give the top ranking project their first choice of resources. And, when you get down lower in the process, those first choice resources may be gone, and we would award the second or third resources to the awardees. So I guess, any thoughts on that, Tony, on sort of how you think that should work, or from our audience participants? And James, do you think, did you ever consider that sort of as a way of doing business in Minnesota? And do you see any pros and cons to that approach here in California, if we were to kind of have more of have the developers have more say in the resources they receive as opposed to the state agency?
Go ahead, James.
Sure. Honestly, no, we have not contemplated going in that direction, other than developers having the option whether they're willing to accept 4% tax credits. Because for some developers, 4%, we know it just is more complex than 9%. And since we do both, there's just sort of a natural fit there. As I mentioned before, since our different deferred loan resources do have some mutually exclusive uses, they sort of assign themselves just based on the type of project that's submitted. So I think trying to get into that and then actually teach everyone about the different resources would add more complexity. And I would get a little bit nervous that you'd end up jumping a lot around if you have a single scoring system versus trying to get more of those higher priority, because really if it's higher score, I'm going to make the assumption they're a higher priority project. Where they could have had an opportunity, but then don't. For us, again, since it's been so ingrained in the system, most people are just like, yeah, give me money. I'll take what you can give us.
Yeah, from my perspective, the way I like to think about it is I like to think that the developers sort of can apply for, not apply, but have a checkbox. I'm willing to take all of these different types of funds, and then the allocating entity would work through and then most efficiently allocate which funds fit the different projects. Sort of like you were saying, from the highest scoring would probably get their top choices, but also, we have funds like VHHP, or like for veterans, or we have specific programs that may only work for permanent supportive housing. And then we want to target those first. The more restrictive funds, I think we'd want to use first. And then the less restrictive funds like MHP or the state tax credits would ultimately be allocated last, because more projects could fit into those.
Right. So save the general funds for as you move down and use up the specialized funds first in a way. Okay.
And that's not to say all the specialized funds would be used first, because there's probably fewer applicants that can use those too. So, but that would be my general thought about how to do this. I think, again, there's ways we can think through this and talk through it and understand how that works. But I do think we can't, there has to be some algorithm, for lack of a better term, at the state level to figure out how to allocate these funds. We can't just say, you're number one, what money do you want? Or else that would just be a never-ending process of back and forth that we would, could take very long to get through.
Yeah, and I'll note, once we assign the funding source, it is not a negotiating point after selection. It's if we gave you this particular funding source, that's what the project is, even if you don't like it.
Yeah, I do think the one piece of the one-stop shop that will work better, with the housing accelerator funds that were approved last year, we wouldn't run into those problems, because if a project came and applied, they would know right up front if they're getting all of the funds they need to close the project or they're not being awarded. So you don't get partially awarded and then a year later find out you didn't get the next award that you needed. It's all one yes or no, and then you can apply, the following round.
Right. We end up with fully funded projects, which I think is a real key for all of us here. So, one of the other particular challenges we have here in California is that the state housing agencies are really split across constitutional officers. So, under the governor, the Department of Housing, the California Housing Finance Agency administer programs, while the tax credits and bonds are administered under committees. The treasurer is the chair of the committee and oversees the staff of both of those entities. And as we think about this, I think we've been very careful to try and, not take away anyone's power, for lack of a better phrase, right? I mean, that's just a lot of political difficulties with that. So we've tried to maintain a balance of power. And Tony, can you give me some thoughts on sort of how we, what governance structure we might want to put in place, like what AB 2305 proposes, for example, that would try and maintain that balance of power?
Yeah, I think, the one piece that's important is having the governing boards that oversee the different entities. So right now, for example, TCAC right now has a board with 5 board members, 3 of which report through to the governor. So it's a weird outcome where we have, the governor having control of the board, yet the treasurer administering the program. So I think what we need to do is we do want to keep this division of powers on the new board that's being set up. Our current proposal in 2305 is to have 2 of the board members be appointed by the governor, 2 by the treasurer, and 1 by the controller, so that we would have the division of powers still there. I think as we work through the process of the administration of these, we would still have the administration of the tax credits and the bonds be done at the treasurer's office, the administration of the housing, the HCD funds being done at HCD, but at least the allocation, the projects coming in would know sort of an all or nothing, have that ready to go, their project funding ready to go through the state.
The way I like to think of it is, really at TCAC, and so like now the various state housing agencies are involved. But if we do the one-stop shop, it's really no one loses power, but every agency is involved in every other agency's decision. We're all sort of, and we're all working collaboratively. We all have influence over each other's programs, and therefore we need to work in a single, row the boat in a single direction.
I think that's very true. I think right now the treasurer doesn't really have much input on what gets awarded at HCD, but going forward, if we have this single stop allocation process, there would be a more collaborative approach to allocating that.
Right. And HCD would has impact now through TCAC and SIDLAC. And so it'd be sort of mutually respectful in both ways. Okay. I'm looking at we're at time. So I want to thank James particularly. Ruth has already moved on to another meeting, but James, thank you so much. And I hope you don't mind if we continue to bug you as we move forward in this process and really kind of get some thought, use a thought partner in this process. Again, I find from my purposes, the Minnesota to be quite an inspirational approach for us to learn from and to emulate with our own, obviously with our own tweaks and differences, as we will need to do that. But it gives us sort of something to shoot for. And most importantly to me, it shows that this can be done. It can be done, and it can be done. Not that it's, without a bit of brain damage, but it's actually probably better than the alternative in terms of brain damage even. So that to me is actually a really heartening sort of takeaway from a lot of this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely do reach out. I've been both the applicant for the resources and now in the bureaucratic side of trying to help keep it moving in different ways. So where we can provide assistance, happy to do so.
Yeah. And then I had a couple comments, which I will take to heart. And then sort of one question: would California think about assigning, forward allocating, as you say. And I think that's probably a tougher one for us. I mean, I think it would just be a big change in timing and whatnot. I think we're pretty wedded to the idea that projects are ready to go, that once they receive these awards, they can close in 6 months. But I think there's something food for thought there for us too, on whether we might want to look at a forward allocating approach where people don't have to put all the investment into entitlements before they know if they're, going to be funded or whatnot. There's definitely pros and cons there. Well, thank you all to our participants, and again, James and Tony and Megan for helping put this together. I know we have another panel at 10:30, so I'll let everyone go get a coffee break and whatnot. And thank you for joining us at the morning session, Housing California. Goodbye, everybody.